The gas pump read 3.37s when Robert Morrison's quarters ran out, but he needed $4 to make it home. When the motorcycle gang behind him started mocking his poverty and their leader violently shoved him away from the pump, the 83-year-old crashed to the concrete. But as his jacket ripped apart from the impact, exposing a faded Navy SEAL tattoo with warrior etched beneath it, the station manager realized these bikers hadn't just assaulted a poor old man, they had just destroyed a living legend. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Murphy's gas station, a family-owned operation that had been serving the outskirts of Phoenix for 37 years. The heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves, making the air dance and blur as customers moved between the pumps and the small convenience store that had seen better decades. At pump number 3, a solitary figure stood motionless in the oppressive heat, an old man who looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Robert Steele Morrison was 83 years old, though the harsh lines carved into his weathered face and the careful way he moved suggested someone who had lived far more than his years. His clothes told the story of a man who had fallen through society's cracks. A faded denim jacket that had once been blue, jeans with patches covering patches, and boots that were held together more by duct tape than leather. In his weathered hands he clutched a small pile of quarters, dimes, and nickels, the kind of loose change that most people would barely notice, but which represented Robert's entire transportation budget for the week. What the other customers at Murphy's gas station didn't know was that Robert Morrison had once been one of the most dangerous men alive. For 28 years he had served with Naval Special Warfare Command, rising through the ranks to become a SEAL team operator specializing in deep reconnaissance and direct action missions. He had served in Vietnam, Lebanon, Grenada, Panama, and the Persian Gulf, accumulating more confirmed kills than most entire infantry units. His call sign had been Steel because of his unbreakable will under pressure and his ability to complete missions that others deemed impossible. But that was 40 years ago, in a world that had forgotten him as completely as the government that had classified most of his service record. Now Robert Morrison was just another old man counting change at a gas station, trying to figure out how to stretch 3.47s into enough fuel to get his 1995 Honda Civic home, the trailer park where he lived on Social Security checks that barely covered rent, let alone dignity. The gas pump's digital display mocked him with its numbers. 3.47 pumped, 4 pounds minimum for credit card transactions. He was 53 cents short of the minimum, and his car's gas gauge was sitting just above empty. The math was simple and unforgiving. He needed exactly $4 to make it home, and he had exactly 53 cents less than that. Robert had been standing at the pump for nearly 10 minutes, counting and recounting his change, hoping that somehow the coins would multiply in his hands. But mathematics didn't care about desperation, and 53 cents remained 53 cents no matter how many times he counted. Behind him, engines rumbled with the deep, aggressive growl that could only come from high-performance motorcycles. Robert glanced over his shoulder to see a group of 5 bikers waiting for him to finish, their machines gleaming with chrome and attitude. They wore leather vests over expensive t-shirts, designer jeans, and boots that probably cost more than Robert's monthly income. These weren't the hardened outlaws of popular imagination. They were weekend warriors, middle-aged professionals, who had discovered that motorcycles and leather gave them a sense of danger and rebellion that their suburban lives lacked. Dentists and accountants and middle managers who played at being tough guys on the weekends, riding in formation to bars where they could intimidate people who couldn't fight back. Their leader was a man in his 40s named Craig Brennan, a successful real estate developer who rode a $30,000 Harley-Davidson and cultivated an image of barely controlled violence that was as artificial as his weekend tan. He wore wraparound sunglasses even though they were under the gas station's canopy, and his arms were covered with tattoos that he'd acquired not in prison or military service, but from expensive parlors in trendy neighborhoods. "Hey, old man," Craig called out, revving his engine for emphasis. "You gonna count those pennies all day, or you gonna move your ass?" Robert didn't respond immediately. He'd learned long ago that engaging with predators often only encouraged them. Instead, he continued counting his change, hoping to find some combination of coins that would add up to $4. "I said move it, Grandpa." Craig's voice carried more aggression now, drawing the attention of the other bikers and several customers at nearby pumps. Robert finally turned around, his movements careful and deliberate. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to figure out—" "Figure out what?" Craig interrupted. "How to be a bigger pain in the ass. Look at you, standing there with your little pile of change like some homeless bum. You can't even afford gas. What are you doing here?" The other bikers laughed at this, emboldened by their leader's cruelty. One of them, a stocky man with a beer gut hanging over his leather belt, revved his engine and added, "Maybe he's collecting donations." "Hey, Grandpa, need a quarter for the bus?" More laughter, louder and meaner. Robert felt his face flush with embarrassment, but he kept his voice steady. "I just need a few more minutes," he said. "Maybe I can find some change in my car." "A few more minutes?" Craig's voice rose to a near shout. "We've been waiting behind you for 10 minutes already. Some of us have places to be, things to do. We don't have time to watch some broke-down old fool count pocket change." Robert turned back to the pump, his hands shaking slightly, as he tried once more to count his money. But the humiliation was making it difficult to concentrate, and the coins seemed to blur together in his weathered palms. "Please," he said quietly, not turning around. "I'll be quick." "Please?" Craig's voice dripped with mock sympathy. "Did you hear that, boys? Grandpa's begging now." The laughter that followed was like a pack of hyenas discovering wounded prey. Robert felt something crack inside his chest, not physically, but spiritually. The last remnant of the pride he'd carried through decades of military service and years of civilian struggle. But Craig Brennan wasn't finished. "You know what your problem is, old man," he said, dismounting his bike and walking toward Robert with the swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Your problem is you don't know when you're not wanted." He grabbed Robert's shoulder with unnecessary force, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of the old man's jacket. "So, let me help you figure it out." What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses would later have trouble describing the exact sequence of events. Craig Brennan, emboldened by the laughter of his fellow bikers and the apparent helplessness of his target, shoved Robert Morrison away from the gas pump with enough force to send the 83-year-old veteran stumbling backward. Robert's legs, weakened by age and old combat injuries, couldn't handle the sudden momentum. His feet tangled, his balance failed, and he crashed to the asphalt with a sound that made everyone within earshot wince. The impact was devastating. Robert's body hit the concrete like a bag of broken glass, his head snapping back and striking the pavement with a sickening crack. His change scattered across the asphalt in a metallic rain, quarters and dimes rolling under cars and disappearing into storm drains. But it was what happened to his jacket that changed everything. The fabric, already weakened by years of wear and washing, couldn't survive the violent impact with the rough asphalt. It tore along the chest seam with a sound like thunder, splitting wide and exposing Robert's weathered torso to the afternoon sun and the staring eyes of everyone at Murphy's gas station. And there, etched deep into the scarred skin over his heart, was a tattoo that made the world suddenly very quiet. It wasn't the usual military ink that customers might expect from an old veteran. No eagles or flags or patriotic slogans. This was something far more specific, far more deadly. A Navy SEAL trident, black ink faded but unmistakable. Below it, a skull and crossbones with maritime warfare symbols that spoke of classified operations and deadly missions, and underneath all of it, in letters that had been burned into flesh during a secret ceremony 40 years ago, "Warrior steel will never break." The 5 bikers stared at the tattoo without initially understanding what they were seeing. But someone else at Murphy's gas station understood immediately. Jim Murphy, the station's owner and manager, had been restocking the ice machine when he heard the commotion outside. He'd looked through the window to see what appeared to be a routine confrontation, some bikers hassling a customer. He'd seen it before, would probably see it again. But when the old man hit the ground and his jacket tore open, Jim dropped the bag of ice he'd been carrying. Because Jim Murphy had served 8 years in the Navy before taking over his family's gas station. He'd never been a SEAL himself, but he'd worked alongside them during Operation Desert Storm. He'd seen that particular combination of tattoos exactly once before, on the chest of a SEAL operator who had single-handedly eliminated an entire enemy patrol to clear the way for Jim's unit to complete their mission. The Navy SEAL trident wasn't something you got at a tattoo parlor in San Diego. It was earned in blood, in classified operations, in places that didn't appear on official maps. And the warrior designation with the "Steel will never break" motto was specific to operators who had completed the most dangerous assignments under the most extreme conditions. Jim Murphy burst through the station's front door like a man possessed. "Get away from him," he roared, his voice carrying across the gas station with the authority of someone who had learned to command in life-or-death situations. The bikers looked up, startled by the interruption. Craig Brennan still stood over Robert's prone form, his hand still extended from the shove that had sent the old man crashing to the ground. "Mind your own business," Craig snarled, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. "That is my business," Jim replied, his voice deadly quiet as he approached. "And you five just made the biggest mistake of your lives." He knelt beside Robert, who was struggling to sit up despite the obvious pain from his fall. The SEAL tattoo was fully exposed, impossible to ignore. "Sir," Jim said respectfully, "are you injured?" Robert looked up at him with eyes that held decades of pain and dignity. "I'll be all right," he said quietly. "Just need to get up." Jim helped him to a sitting position, being careful not to jar any potential injuries. As he did, he spoke loudly enough for everyone at the gas station to hear. "Gentlemen, meet Robert Morrison, Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy SEALs. The man you just assaulted is one of the most decorated warriors in American military history." The effect was immediate and profound. Conversations stopped throughout the gas station. Customers at other pumps turned to stare. The five bikers looked between Jim and Robert with growing confusion and fear. "That's impossible," Craig said, but his voice shook. "He's just some homeless bum counting change." "Look at him again," Jim commanded. "Look at his posture. Look at his scars. Look at the way he carries himself even after you knocked him down. That's not some homeless bum. That's a man who has eliminated more enemies than you've had successful real estate deals." Jim was already pulling out his phone. "And I'm calling the police. What you did is assault, and given who you did it to, it's also a federal crime." The bikers exchanged nervous glances. The situation was spiraling beyond their control, and they were beginning to understand that they'd picked the wrong target. But Robert raised his hands slowly. "No police," he said quietly. Jim looked at him in surprise. "Sir, these men assaulted you. They need to face consequences." "They will," Robert said, slowly getting to his feet with Jim's help. "Living with what they did today, knowing what kind of men they chose to become, that's consequence enough." He looked directly at Craig Brennan, who was no longer swaggering or sneering. The biker's expensive sunglasses couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. "You saw an old man counting change and decided he was fair game for your amusement," Robert said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone listening feel the weight of his words. "You never once considered that he might be someone deserving of respect. You never asked why he was struggling, or if there was anything you could do to help. You just saw weakness and decided to exploit it." Craig tried to salvage some dignity from the situation. "Look, we're sorry. We were just having some fun. We didn't mean anything by it." "Yes, you did mean it," Robert replied. "You meant every bit of it. You saw someone you thought was powerless and decided to hurt them because you could. The only thing you're sorry about is finding out you picked the wrong target." His words hit harder than any physical blow could have. By now other customers had gathered around, drawn by the commotion in the revelation of Robert's true identity. An older woman who had been filling up her sedan approached with obvious respect. "Sir," she said, "thank you for your service, and I'm sorry for what these people did to you." Her words seemed to break a dam. Other customers began approaching, offering similar thanks and apologies. A young father lifted his son onto his shoulders and quietly explained why the man on the ground deserved their respect. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. One of the other bikers, not Craig, but a quieter member of the group who had participated in the mocking but hadn't thrown the decisive shove, approached Robert with obvious reluctance. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize. Not because of who you are, but because of what we became today. We became bullies who hurt someone for entertainment. That's not who I want to be." Robert looked at him for a long moment. "What's your name, son?" "Danny. Danny Peterson." "Well, Danny Peterson, you have a choice to make. You can let this moment define you as someone who participated in cruelty, or you can let it transform you into someone who stands up against it. Which man do you want to be?" Danny nodded slowly. "I know which one, sir. And I'm going to make sure I become that man." Jim Murphy, meanwhile, was gathering Robert's scattered change from the asphalt. Most of the coins had rolled away or fallen into unreachable places, but he managed to collect about $2 worth. "Sir," he said, "your gas is on the house. Today and every day you come here." "That's not necessary," Robert protested. "Yes, it is," Jim said firmly. "It's the least we can do." As Jim filled Robert's car with gas, the 5 bikers stood in uncomfortable silence, processing what had just occurred. Their earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by shame and the dawning understanding of what they had done. Craig Brennan, who had seemed so confident and aggressive just minutes before, looked like a deflated balloon. The respect and fear he'd tried to cultivate through intimidation had backfired spectacularly, revealing him as nothing more than a middle-aged bully who picked on people he thought couldn't fight back. "We should go," he mumbled to his crew. But as they began to mount their bikes, Robert called out to them. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying despite its quietness, "I want you to remember something. Every person you meet is fighting battles you can't see. The next time you encounter someone who looks different, who seems vulnerable, who doesn't fit your idea of what's normal, remember this moment. Remember how it felt to realize you'd hurt someone who didn't deserve it." The 5 bikers rode away without their usual fanfare, their engines subdued and their formations scattered. Each of them carried with them the weight of a lesson they would never forget. As Robert's car started and he prepared to drive home, Jim Murphy approached his window. "Sir, I hope you'll keep coming here. This place is better with you in it." Robert smiled, the first genuine smile he'd shown in months. "I'll be back next week. Same pump. And if anyone gives you trouble, they'll answer to me," Jim said with conviction. Word of what had happened at Murphy's gas station spread quickly through the community, not because anyone sought publicity, but because stories of justice and recognition have a way of traveling on their own. The local veterans organization heard about Robert's situation and reached out to help him access benefits he'd never known he was entitled to. A review of his service record revealed that he had never received several decorations he had earned, and that his disability rating had been incorrectly calculated for decades. The motorcycle club that Craig Brennan belonged to expelled him after learning about the incident. The other members, genuine motorcycle enthusiasts who valued honor and respect, made it clear that his behavior was not representative of their values. Danny Peterson, the biker who had apologized, kept his promise to transform himself. He began volunteering at a local veterans shelter, working to help homeless veterans find housing and support. When asked why he dedicated so much of his free time to the cause, he would simply say, "I learned something important about heroes not always looking heroic." But perhaps the most significant change was in Robert Morrison himself. For years, he had felt invisible, forgotten, like a burden on a society that had moved on without him. The incident at Murphy's gas station reminded him that his service had value, that his sacrifices had meaning, and that there were still people who understood the true cost of freedom. 6 months later, Robert received an invitation that would change his life once more. The Navy SEAL Association had heard about his story and wanted to honor him at their annual reunion ceremony. When he expressed hesitation about attending, worried that he no longer fit in with the SEAL community, the response was immediate and clear: he would always be family. At the ceremony, held at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, Robert Morrison stood before an assembly of America's most elite warriors. When he was introduced, the entire room stood in recognition. Men who rarely showed emotion, who had been trained to compartmentalize feelings and focus on missions. Master Chief Morrison, the commanding officer said, represents the best of what it means to be a SEAL, not just because of his decorated service record, but because of the dignity with which he has carried himself through every challenge life has thrown at him. The applause that followed was respectful but brief. These men didn't need dramatic gestures to communicate their understanding and respect. After the ceremony, Robert was approached by dozens of current and former SEALs who wanted to share their own stories, to make connections, to ensure he knew he was valued and remembered. But the conversation that meant the most came from a young petty officer who was preparing for his first deployment. "Sir," the young man said, "I wanted you to know that your service record is part of our training curriculum. The missions you completed in the 80s and 90s established tactical principles we still follow today. You may have felt forgotten, but your legacy lives on in every operation we conduct successfully." Robert felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with his old wounds, and everything to do with the recognition that his life had mattered, that his service had value beyond the classified files and faded memories. When Robert returned home to Phoenix, he found that his world had expanded in ways he never could have anticipated. Murphy's gas station had become an unofficial gathering place for local veterans, a place where Jim Murphy made sure everyone was treated with dignity and respect. The incident with the motorcycle gang had become a teaching moment for the entire community. Local schools invited Robert to speak about the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. "Heroes don't always look heroic," he would tell students. "Sometimes they're the quiet person sitting next to you on the bus, the elderly person counting change at the store, the veteran struggling to make ends meet. Your job isn't to identify who's a hero and who isn't. Your job is to treat everyone like they might be." A year after the gas station incident, Robert Morrison was living in a proper apartment instead of a trailer, receiving the medical care and benefits he had earned through his service, and surrounded by a community that valued his presence and respected his sacrifices. Craig Brennan, the biker who had shoved him, never returned to Murphy's gas station. But Robert heard through the community that the man had undergone his own transformation, selling his expensive motorcycle and using the money to donate to veterans' organizations. Sometimes the harshest lessons led to the most meaningful redemption. The torn jacket that had exposed Robert's tattoo was eventually replaced, but he kept it as a reminder of the day his life changed. Not because he was assaulted, but because he was finally seen for who he really was. When Robert Morrison passed away peacefully 5 years later, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. Navy SEALs served as pallbearers. The mayor spoke about how one man's story had changed an entire community's approach to veteran services. And Jim Murphy delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of who Robert had been. "Robert Morrison never asked to be recognized," Jim said. "He never demanded special treatment. He never used his service record to gain advantage or sympathy. He simply carried himself with quiet dignity, faced his struggles with courage, and treated everyone he met with respect." The inscription on Robert's headstone, chosen by his fellow SEALs, read, "Master Chief Robert Steele Morrison. His steel will never broke, and his example made us all stronger." The Navy SEAL tattoo that had shocked a gas station full of witnesses had become a symbol of something larger. The recognition that heroism often hides in plain sight, that service comes in many forms, and that the strongest among us are frequently those who suffer in silence while asking for nothing more than basic human dignity. At Murphy's gas station, a small plaque now hangs inside the convenience store. In honor of Master Chief Robert Morrison, he taught us that every customer has a story worth respecting. It serves as a daily reminder that behind every transaction, every interaction, every moment of human contact, there might be a story of sacrifice and service that deserves recognition. The gas pump where Robert had counted his change still operates today, but now it's never just about fuel. It's about community, about respect, about the understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in the everyday moments where we choose to see the humanity in everyone we meet. Robert Steele Morrison completed his final mission not with weapons or tactics, but with the simple power of dignity maintained under pressure. He taught an entire community that true strength isn't measured by how much money you have in your pocket, but by how you treat others when you think no one is watching. And in a world that too often forgets its heroes, that lesson continues to echo every time someone shows kindness to a stranger, respect to an elder, or compassion to someone who appears to be struggling. The steel will never broke, and neither did the example it set for everyone who witnessed it.